Welcome back to History Unlocked. I'm Mr MacAulay. Today, we're going to be diving into something absolutely mind-blowing. The intellectual achievements of ancient Egypt. We're talking about a civilization that invented one of the world's first writing systems, created literature that still moves us today, and developed mathematical concepts we use in modern engineering. Think about it this way. The people in most parts of the world were still passing down knowledge through oral tradition. Ancient Egyptians were writing instruction manuals and love letters, medical textbooks, adventure stories, and mathematical proofs. They were basically running a Bronze Age information society. Today we're going to crack the code on hieroglyphs, meet some ancient authors whose work is still published today, explore mathematical discoveries that built the pyramids, and uncover scientific knowledge that was so advanced it seems almost magical. And I promise you, by the end of this episode, you'll never look at ancient Egypt the same way again. So let's start with one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, the invention of writing. Around 3200 BCE, right around the time Egypt was being unified, something revolutionary happened. The Egyptians figured out how to capture human speech and preserve it forever using symbols carved in stone and written on papyrus. But Egyptian hieroglyphs weren't just the world's first writing system. They were one of the most sophisticated and beautiful writing systems ever created. The word hieroglyph literally means sacred carvings, and that's exactly what the ancient Egyptians thought they were. These weren't just practical marks for keeping records, they were divine symbols that connected the human world to the realm of the gods. Here's what makes hieroglyphs so incredibly clever. They work on multiple levels simultaneously. Some signs represent sounds, like letters in our alphabet. Others represent complete words or ideas, and some are determinatives that tell you how to interpret the other symbols. It's like having an alphabet, a dictionary, and a grammar guide all built into the same writing system. Let me give you an example of just how sophisticated this system was. So let's take the Egyptian word for scribe, sesh. It's written with 3 hieroglyphs: a palette and a reed pen, representing the tools of writing, a star representing the sh sound, and a seated man, the determinative that tells you this word refers to a person. In just 3 symbols, you get the profession, the pronunciation, and the context. That's incredibly efficient communication. But hieroglyphs weren't just for practical writing. The Egyptians believed the hieroglyph had magical power. Writing someone's name gave that person a kind of immortality. Destroying someone's written name could literally erase them from existence. This is why pharaohs' names were carved so deeply in stone. They were trying to ensure eternal life through the power of the written word. The process of learning to read and write hieroglyphs was incredibly demanding. Student scribes had to memorize over 700 different signs, learn the complex rules for how they combined, and master the art of beautiful writing. It typically took about 12 years to become fully literate, longer than it takes to get through modern primary and high school combined. But let's step into an ancient Egyptian scribal school and see what education really looked like 4,000 years ago. Because these weren't just casual learning environments, these were intensive intellectual boot camps that created an educated elite who ran Egyptian civilization. Students started around the age of 5 and began with the basics, learning to hold a reed pen, preparing writing surfaces, and practicing the simplest hieroglyphic signs. They wrote on broken pottery shards called ostraka because papyrus was too expensive for students to practice on. Imagine learning to write on pieces of broken dishes. It definitely motivated you to get things right. The curriculum was surprisingly comprehensive. Students learned not just writing, but mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, history, and religious texts. They studied classic literature, practiced business correspondence, and learned the proper forms for official documents. By graduation, a scribe was basically the ancient equivalent of having degrees in literature, business, law, and public administration. We have actual student exercises that survived from these schools, and some of them are quite hilarious. Students would copy moral instructions over and over. Be skilled in speech, then you will succeed. The tongue of a man is his rudder. Teachers would assign sentences like, a scribe's fingers are his beauty. They are fatter than all other trades. Basically ancient Egyptian propaganda about how it was great to be a scribe. Some student work shows corrections in the teacher's hand, spelling mistakes, and even doodles in the margins. One student exercise includes the complaint, "My heart is weary of this work," and apparently ancient Egyptian students complained about homework just like modern students do too. For over 1,400 years after the last hieroglyphic text was written, the secret of reading ancient Egyptian was almost completely lost. European scholars could see these beautiful, mysterious symbols covering Egyptian monuments, but they had no idea what they meant. Some thought they were pure picture writing. Others believed they contained mystical secrets, but no one could actually read them. But then in 1799, French soldiers in Napoleon's army discovered something incredible near the town of Rosetta, a black stone slab with the same text written in 3 different scripts: Hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. The Rosetta Stone was like finding the ultimate cheat sheet. Since scholars could read Ancient Greek, they had the key to unlocking the other scripts. It still took over 20 years of brilliant detective work by scholars like Thomas Young and Jean-Francois to crack the code. But the breakthrough came when they realized the cartouches, those oval shapes surrounding certain hieroglyphs, contained royal names. By comparing the Greek text meaning Ptolemy with the hieroglyphic cartouches, he figured out which symbols represented which sounds. From there, he could work backward to understand how the entire writing system worked. When Champollion finally announced he had deciphered the hieroglyphs in 1822, it was like opening a door that had been locked for over a millennium. Suddenly, ancient Egypt could speak again. The temple walls revealed their secrets, papyri told their stories, and an entire lost literature was reborn. Now that we can read hieroglyphs, we've discovered that ancient Egyptians created some of the world's earliest and possibly greatest literature. These weren't just religious texts or government records, but they wrote novels and short stories. They wrote poetry, adventure tales, and even some comedies. So let me introduce you to some ancient bestsellers that are still in print today. The story of Sinuhe is basically ancient Egypt's first novel, written around 2000 BCE. It's the story of a court official who flees Egypt after a political crisis, lives in exile among foreign peoples, becomes a great warrior and leader, but ultimately longs to return home. It's got everything you could need: political intrigue, action sequences, romance, and a satisfying ending. Hollywood could make a story today and it would be a hit. Then there's The Eloquent Peasant, a story about a farmer who gets robbed by a corrupt official and demands justice. But when he appeals to the authorities, his speeches are so brilliant that they keep delaying his case just to hear more of his eloquent arguments. It's simultaneously a legal thriller, a social commentary, and a celebration of the power of good rhetoric. Egyptian love poetry is also quite beautiful and surprisingly modern in its emotions. Here's a sample from a love poem written over 3,000 years ago. The voice of the swallow speaks and says, "The land has brightened. What is your road? You shall not, O bird, disturb me. I have found my brother in his bed, and my heart is still more glad." That could have been written yesterday. Egyptian literature also included wisdom literature, basically ancient self-help books filled with practical advice for living well. The instructions of Ptahhotep include gems like, "Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed," and "Do not be proud of your knowledge." These texts were so popular they were copied and recopied for thousands of years. What's remarkable about Egyptian literature is how it reveals the inner lives and emotions of people from thousands of years ago. These weren't alien beings, these were humans dealing with love, loss, ambition, fear, and hope in many ways that are very recognizable to us today. But no discussion of Egyptian writing would be complete without talking about the most famous Egyptian text, the Book of the Dead. This wasn't actually a single book. It was a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions designed to help the deceased navigate the afterlife successfully. The Book of the Dead was like the ultimate survival guide for the afterlife. It included maps of the underworld, passwords for getting past dangerous guardians, spells for transforming into different animals, and most famously, the negative confession, a list of sins the deceased had to deny committing before they could enter paradise. Different versions of the Book of the Dead were customized for different people. Wealthy Egyptians could afford elaborate illustrated versions with their names inserted into the spells, whereas poorer people might have simpler versions with just the most essential texts. It was like having a personalized guidebook for the afterlife. But what's fascinating about the Book of the Dead is how it reveals Egyptian beliefs about morality and justice. The deceased had to swear they hadn't killed, stolen, lied, cheated on taxes, been cruel to servants, or polluted water sources. This wasn't just religious mumbo-jumbo, it was a comprehensive ethical code that governed all daily behaviour. Ancient Egyptian mathematics was far more sophisticated than most people realise. These weren't just people who could count and add, they were mathematical innovators who developed techniques and concepts that were essential for building pyramids, managing the economy, and advancing scientific knowledge. Egyptian mathematics was practical and problem-oriented. They didn't do math for its own sake, they used it to solve real-world challenges. How do you calculate the amount of grain in a triangular pile? How do you determine the correct angle for a pyramid's sides? How do you fairly divide an inheritance among multiple heirs? The Egyptians developed their own number system, using hieroglyphic symbols. They had separate signs for 1, 10, 100, 1000, and so on, up to 1,000,000. To write the number 2749, they would draw 2,000 symbols, 700 symbols, 410 symbols, and 9 unit symbols. It was more cumbersome than our modern system, but it worked perfectly well for their needs. Egyptian mathematicians were masters of fractions, especially fractions with 1 as the numerator. They developed incredibly sophisticated methods for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions. The Rind mathematical papyrus, written around 1650 BCE, contains 85 mathematical problems that demonstrate techniques still taught in schools today. But one of their most impressive achievements was calculating the area of a circle. They used a formula that gave them a value for pi of approximately 3.16, remarkably close to the actual value of 3.14159. This level of mathematical precision was essential for their architectural achievements. The mathematical precision of the pyramids is wild, to say the least. The Great Pyramid's base is level to within just 2.1 centimetres across its 13-acre area. The 4 sides are equal in length within 2 centimetres. That's an accuracy of 99.98%. The pyramid is aligned to true north with an error of only 3/60th of a degree. Achieving this precision required mathematical knowledge that goes far beyond basic arithmetic. Pyramid builders had to understand geometry, trigonometry, and surveying techniques. They needed to calculate volumes, weights, and structural forces. They had to coordinate the work of thousands of people using mathematical planning and scheduling. The pyramid builders used a measuring unit called the royal cubit, which was divided into 28 fingers. But they didn't just measure things roughly, they used fractional measurements accurate to tiny fractions of a finger. Their measuring tools were precisely calibrated and regularly checked for accuracy. Recent analysis has revealed that the Great Pyramid incorporates sophisticated mathematical relationships. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter is almost exactly equal to the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. In other words, pi is built into the pyramid's design. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is still debated, but it demonstrates the mathematical sophistication of the builders. Ancient Egyptians were serious astronomers too, who made observations and discoveries that were essential for their calendar, their religious practices, and their architectural projects. They didn't just look at the stars for fun, they used astronomy as a practical tool for running their civilization. The Egyptian calendar was one of the most accurate in the ancient world. They figured out that the year was approximately 365 days long, remarkably close to the actual 365.25 days. They based their calendar on both solar observations and the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which coincided with the annual Nile flood. Egyptian astronomers identified and named many constellations that we still recognize today. They saw the Big Dipper as the bull's thigh, Orion as Osiris, and created detailed star charts that showed the positions of celestial objects throughout the year. They built astronomical observatories and developed sophisticated instruments for measuring celestial movements. The Merkhet was an ancient Egyptian sighting tool, used to determine true north by observing the stars. They used water clocks and sundials to measure time with remarkable precision. Egyptian astronomy wasn't about practical timekeeping, it was deeply connected to their religious beliefs. They believed that the pharaoh's soul travelled to join the stars after death, particularly the imperishable stars that never set below the horizon. The pyramid texts are full of astronomical references that describe the deceased king's journey through the heavens. Egyptian medicine was also incredibly advanced for its time, combining practical treatments with religious healing practices. Egyptian physicians were famous throughout the ancient world, and even foreign rulers like the Persian kings called for Egyptian doctors when they were ill. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BCE, reads like a modern medical textbook. It describes 48 different surgical cases from head injuries to broken bones, with rational diagnoses and treatments. The language is precise and scientific. If you examine a man having a break in his upper arm, you should say, "One having a break in his upper arm, an ailment which I will treat." Egyptian physicians understood anatomy better than doctors in most later civilizations because they learned from the mummification practices. They knew that the heart pumped blood, that the pulse could indicate health problems, and that the brain controlled bodily functions. They performed surgery, set broken bones, and even did cataract operations. The Egyptians also developed an impressive pharmacology. They used over 700 different drugs made from plants, animals, and minerals. Many of their remedies contained ingredients that we now know have genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark containing aspirin-like compounds, honey, a natural antibiotic, and various herbs with proven therapeutic effects. Egyptian medical texts show that they understood the importance of hygiene, diet, and lifestyle in maintaining their health. They prescribed exercise, recommended certain foods for specific conditions, and emphasized the importance of cleanliness in preventing disease. But one of the most fascinating institutions in ancient Egypt was the House of Life. Basically, Egypt's version of a university, a research institute, and a library combined into one. These were the centers of learning attached to the major temples where scholars studied, copied text, and advanced human knowledge. The House of Life wasn't just a place where scribes copied some old texts. It was where new knowledge was created. Scholars worked on problems in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and theology. They conducted what we might recognize as scientific research, testing ideas and developing new theories. These institutions preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. When a master physician or mathematician died, his knowledge didn't die with him because it had been written down and copied at the House of Life. This system of knowledge preservation was one of the keys to Egypt's civilization's longevity. The House of Life also served as a kind of ancient patent office. New medical treatments, mathematical techniques, and engineering innovations were recorded and shared among scholars throughout Egypt. This created a network of intellectual exchange that accelerated the pace of discovery. But Egyptian scientists made discoveries that were truly ahead of their time. They understood that disease could be caused by natural factors, not just supernatural ones. They developed the first known pregnancy test involving grain and urine, and it actually worked. They created effective contraceptives that understood basic principles of anatomy and physiology. In chemistry, Egyptians developed sophisticated techniques for metalworking, glassworking, and creating pigments and dyes. They understood chemical processes like fermentation and used them to make bread, beer, and wine. Their mummification process required detailed knowledge of preservation and chemistry. Egyptian engineers solved incredibly complex technical problems. They figured out how to quarry, transport, and precisely position massive stone blocks. They developed techniques for creating perfectly smooth surfaces, drilling precise holes and joining stones without mortar so tightly that you can't slip a knife blade between them. They also made important advances in metallurgy, developing techniques for working with copper, bronze, gold, and silver. They created alloys. They understood heat treatment and developed specialized tools for different applications. Although it came much later in ancient Egyptian history, we can't really talk about Egyptian intellectual achievements without mentioning the Great Library of Alexandria. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, this was the ancient world's greatest center of learning, attracting scholars from across the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a place to store books, but it was the world's first research university. Scholars came from Greece, Rome, Persia, and beyond to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and philosophy. They conducted experiments, made observations, and published their findings. Famous scholars who worked at Alexandria included Euclid, who systematized geometry, Aristarchus, who proposed the Earth orbited the Sun, and Hipparchus, who created the first star catalogue. Their work was built on thousands of years of Egyptian intellectual achievements. The library represented the culmination of Egyptian learning traditions. It showed what was possible when knowledge was systematically collected, preserved, and built upon by successive generations of scholars. Intellectual achievements of ancient Egypt didn't disappear when the civilization ended. They lived on to influence later cultures and continue shaping our world today. Egyptian mathematical techniques were adopted by the Greeks and Romans, and then passed on to Islamic scholars, and eventually reached medieval Europe. Modern mathematics still uses concepts and methods that were first developed by the ancient Egyptian scribes. Egyptian medical knowledge was preserved in Greek and Islamic texts, and continued to influence medical practices for centuries. Some Egyptian remedies and treatments are still used in traditional medicine today. The Egyptian writing system inspired other writing systems throughout the ancient world. The Phoenician alphabet, which became the ancestor of our modern alphabet, was influenced by Egyptian hieroglyphs. But perhaps most importantly, ancient Egypt showed that human knowledge could be systematically preserved, it could be organized and transmitted across generations. They proved that intellectual achievement could be cumulative, that each generation could build on the discoveries of previous generations to reach even higher levels of understanding. So what can we really learn about Egypt's intellectual achievements? Well, first of all, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, pure research, can lead to practical applications that transform society. Egyptian astronomers studying the stars developed calendar systems that revolutionized agriculture. Mathematical investigations led to engineering techniques that built monuments lasting for thousands of years. Second, that education and literacy are the foundation of civilizational achievement. Egypt's scribal scholars created the educated class that ran the government. They managed the economy, and they advanced human knowledge. Investment in education pays dividends for centuries. Third, that preserving and sharing knowledge is just as important as creating it. Egypt's system of copying texts and maintaining libraries, training new scholars, all ensured that hard-won discoveries weren't lost when individual scholars died. Finally, we can learn that intellectual achievement requires institutional support. The House of Life, scribal schools and libraries, they weren't just luxuries, but they were essential infrastructure for a knowledge-based civilization. So as we wrap up our exploration of ancient Egyptian writing, wisdom, and wonders, I want you to think about something amazing. Every time you read a book, every time you solve a maths problem, every time you visit a doctor, and every time you look at a calendar, you are using intellectual tools that were first developed or perfected by ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. These weren't superhuman beings with lost technologies. They were just people like us, driven by curiosity, ambition, and the desire to understand and improve their world. They faced the same fundamental challenges that we face today. How do we preserve knowledge? How do we educate the next generation? How do we solve complex problems? How do we use what we know to build a better society? The hieroglyphs carved on the temple walls, the mathematical papyri preserved in museums, and the medical texts translated by modern scholars, they all testify to humans' incredible capacity for learning, our capacity for discovery, our capacity for intellectual achievement. Ancient Egypt reminds us the human mind is capable of truly extraordinary things when given the proper tools and training. Their achievements in writing and mathematics and science and literature weren't just impressive for their time, they're impressive today, thousands of years on. So when you're next looking at a set of hieroglyphs in a museum or a movie or maybe at school, remember that you're looking at one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. It's a writing system so sophisticated and beautiful that it captured not just human speech, but it captured human thought itself and preserved it for an eternity. And that's the real magic of ancient Egyptian intellectual achievement. They figured out how to make human knowledge immortal, and in doing so, they made all of us a little bit immortal too.